with a cane. I have chronic pain. I am an aromantic, ADD frantic, partial deaf antics. I'm just your liberal geriatric millennial gal. Hi, my nieces and nephews and nibblings out there. I am so happy to see you today. Now, I want to lecture you today about something that's a little bit personal for me. And I'll kind of give you a little background as to why. I went to college in Florida in the sort of mid to late 2000s. And when I graduated in 2008, it wasn't a great time to get a job like here or anywhere. And so I ended up moving home and staying with my parents in West Virginia for a while until I stumbled into a new career or two. And finally, I got to move back to Florida in 2015. Now, when I first moved here, I really didn't have much involvement in politics. In college, not at all. And when I first moved back after coming, home again, I had other things on my mind. I was, getting my new residency established and, eventually moving into this house after an extensive search. Because the Florida real estate market is always a complicated beast. But so I finally decided to get involved with politics locally down here during the Women's March of January 2018. I went to the march, got registered to vote, learned about some of our local candidates. I didn't know much about our congressman for my congressional district here in Volusia County, which is like Daytona Beach area and all of that jazz. But I did learn about our prospective primary candidates for governor. And I remember thinking during that primary that I liked the eventual Democratic candidate, Andrew Gilliam, but I was concerned that he was a little too left-leaning and wouldn't play statewide. Because Florida is a very divided state, geographically, all sorts of different ways. So it's kind of a toss-up how things can go. And so I wanted us to have our best shot for winning, the governor's office for a Democrat, because we had a Republican governor who was pretty awful, and so I enthusiastically voted for Andrew Gilliam, even if I was a bit concerned that we could have maybe picked a better candidate in the primary. Well, he lost. And the congressman that I didn't really know from my district actually ended up winning the governor's race. And so, yeah, we're responsible for him. Sorry. Oh my gosh. So you may have heard about the recent news story about a group of 50 asylum seekers, primarily from Venezuela, but from multiple countries, who had crossed the border at Texas and applied for asylum, were shipped unceremoniously to Martha's Vineyard in a bit of a political stunt. Something that sort of mimicked Greg Abbott's busing people to Washington, busing migrants to Washington, but in a more targeted way. The ritzy community of Martha's Vineyard had to be the place to have this photo op. Oh, they're not going to want to take in migrants. They're rich and snooty, and I don't know. I don't know what the thinking there was, but I can tell you that I have heard multiple people, including the lawyer who is working with the migrants, an immigration lawyer, posit that what was done to those poor migrants sent off was a crime, because apparently they weren't told where they were going. They were told something else. They were promised housing and jobs and other perks when they were lied to and convinced to go to somewhere that they didn't know where it was and wouldn't have anyone to assist them or way to get support. And that's potentially kidnapping by fraud. They weren't grabbed off the street and dragged to Martha's Vineyard, but they were told things that were incorrect, allegedly, which is how they were gotten to Martha's Vineyard. And this horrible, possibly criminal, cruel act that was done to these people who were doing nothing more than trying to follow the rule, follow the law. They were legally asylum seeking in a country that we always say is the greatest on earth. So how could we, fault them for wanting to come here? Well, it's pretty bizarre to me that the potential criminal who was behind this cruel act of political gamesmanship hasn't shied away from claiming credit for the stunt, for the prank, for the potential alleged kidnapping. Yes, my governor, Ron DeSantis, my former congressman, has proudly proclaimed that not only is he behind this, but he's used taxpayer money to fund the whole endeavor. I'm a Florida taxpayer. Guess how much I like that? Yeah. I don't even know how to express the abject cruelty. Could you imagine what it would be like to think that you had finally been given a helping hand, that you were going to have a place to live, a job to support yourself and your family, to find out that none of it was true, that you were just being used for any reason, let alone just to try to gain some political headlines. I can't even imagine. Those poor people. And it's worse. Apparently, they were also given fake addresses on their paperwork, and many of them are expected to check in all over the country with ICE on Monday morning, and yet they are in Martha's Vineyard and had no way to get anywhere. So they were being set up to be deported too. It's monstrous what was done to these people. But my governor is proudly proclaiming that he did it and he wants to do it again. And he has $12 million of taxpayer money that he's going to throw at the problem, because somehow migrants coming in through Texas are a problem in Florida. Okay. The man literally sent a videographer on the flight so that he'd have video of those people's humiliation. But to him, they're not people, obviously. You can't treat somebody like that if you think that they're a person the same that you are. I don't know. Maybe I'm projecting, but I can't imagine what sort of mindset you would have to be that cruel to anyone. Let alone, somebody who is not a criminal, broke no laws, legally seeking asylum. I don't get it. When Ron DeSantis won the gubernatorial election, he only won it by about 30,000 votes. And, Florida is a fairly heavily populated state. 30,000 votes is not very much. Yet, despite winning with such a narrow margin, and knowing that the state is somewhat split politically, he has always treated it like a mandate from heaven for him to do whatever he wants while in office. They have a Republican legislature, and he has leaned on them heavily to do whatever it is that he wants in his radical extreme agenda. And it does not matter what the people of Florida want. The most prime example of this is when we overwhelmingly voted to restore voting rights for felons in the state of Florida. And yet, Ron DeSantis has not only done everything he can to make that difficult to actually be implemented the way that we wanted it, the voters wanted it, but he has then, because of the little technicalities and rules that he's tried to put in place to keep those people from getting their rights back like we wanted, he has also gone after about 20 of them for voter fraud, because they were unaware that they weren't eligible to vote because of the confusing way that he has implemented this change that we demanded at the voter box. So it is infuriating to see that we made clear what we wanted, and yet he still is doing everything he can to ignore our will and punish anyone who has the audacity to believe that the rights that we voted for them to have were actually theirs to have. Just like the majority of voters in America, the majority of Floridians support of women's right to choose. Abortion access is something that we generally are in favor of, and it should be that a government that represents us would acknowledge that. However, Ron DeSantis has tried repeatedly to tighten restrictions on abortion access or completely remove them. He absolutely does not care if that's what the people who, are his constituents want. It is in his extreme agenda, and he's going to pursue it vociferously. He's gone a little bit quiet on the subject right now because it's obviously very unpopular, but he's still working on this, and you cannot expect that he will not continue to restrict abortion rights in any way that he can. Governor DeSantis doesn't have any problem trying to use the power of his office to punish people who he believes stands against him politically. There is the well-known case of the Reedy Creek Management District, essentially Disney's public utilities, and how he moved to dissolve them as punishment for Disney coming out and opposing his Don't Say Gay bill. They, were just using their First Amendment rights to say what they believed, and he punished them politically for doing so. And it's fairly well documented. He didn't make any real bones about that. But there's also other cases like the Tampa Bay Rays after the Uvalde shooting. One of their pictures is actually from Uvalde, and so they posted a rather touching, uh, comment on their Twitter about, they are going to support um, ending gun violence and whatnot. I mean, pretty reasonable stuff. And he vetoed funding for a practice field for them in retaliation, allegedly. So, it's not something that he has any trouble using the power of his office to try to get people to fall in line politically with him or to not express their beliefs if they're counter to his. And he's also not allegedly beyond using the office of governor to enrich himself. There, of course, is the somewhat controversial 60 Minutes piece that came out about his involvement with the public supermarkets and receiving a large donation to his PAC after they received exclusive rights to the early COVID rollout. And I do remember that. I remember that if you wanted to get a vaccine, it was really hard to do that unless you went to Publix. And so I, at that point, already was not shopping at Publix because I don't really agree with the way that they spend their funds and some of the causes that they have supported politically in the past. But I made it an exception because I'm immunocompromised and I needed to get that vaccination as soon as possible. And so I had to make that decision because there really wasn't any other choice. And it looks like the reason why I was backed into that corner and that choice was taken away from me was because of that donation. Allegedly. The fact of the matter is, I don't believe that Ron DeSantis is a compassionate man, that he has any feeling for his constituents. The only people I believe he cares about are people he believes can enrich him or can increase his power. And one way that I think that has been illustrated is not just his general treatment of LGBTQ plus people in this state, which, don't say gay bill, anti-trans legislation, all of that is fairly well documented. But people don't always remember the other little tells that he gives. I remember the night of the Pulse tragedy very clearly. I hadn't ever been to Pulse, but I'd been to a lot of gay bars in the Orlando area going to drag shows. And, I know quite a few of the area drag queens. And so I absolutely knew people who were there. And luckily I didn't know anybody who passed away. But it still was like a punch in the gut. It was our community. And it was really amazing to see how the community of Orlando came together after that. But one person who didn't come together for us was Ron DeSantis, because he released a statement about the tragedy that did not mention the queer community in any way. A targeted terrorist attack at a queer bar on Hispanic night, on Latino night. And he didn't mention that at all. So after he was called out, he came back and added that language in and went through the motions of pretending to care about what happened. But within just a couple of years, he was already vetoing funding to help those Pulse victims recover. $150,000 in funding he took away from them. and a further $750,000 for queer youth and their housing, which is always problematic. So when it really matters, he's not there for the queer community. He doesn't have any compassion for the queer community. I mean, he doesn't have any compassion for anybody. I mean, this is the man who was named Scoundrel of the Year for 2020. 2020? A lot of stuff happened in 2020, if you'll remember. Scoundrel of the Year for 2020. But it was for his COVID non-response, his denial, his inaction, his callous disregard for the responsibility of his office to protect those of us like me who are vulnerable. He didn't care about protecting us. He did not care about anything other than scoring political points and making money, allegedly. So it just doesn't surprise me when he does things that are callous and cruel on some level. But sometimes I can't help but be taken aback by not just the real deep cruel stuff, just the casual cruel stuff. He was doing a photo op during the pandemic with a bunch of high schoolers behind him, just standing there as political props. And they were, because their school required them to, wearing masks. And when he came in, he shamed them and mocked them for wearing masks. Wow, that's great. Why don't you just make these teenagers feel really super uncomfortable before you use them as political tools? I mean, there is nothing too big or too small for this man, I don't believe. And so that is partly why I wanted to make this video. Because if you keep an eye on the polling, right now, we are always falling just a little short in the polls, both for the governor's race and also to eject Marco Rubio out of the Senate and replace him with Val Dennings. But if you look at the polling, it's pretty close to even, but the Republicans always have a little bit of an edge. And so that means that every vote counts. Every vote. 30,000 voters decided that we would live in this DeSantis hell for the last few years. We can get rid of him. We can move on and not have to deal with being the victims of this pathological, power-hungry, cruel man. We have the ability to vote him out and stop the potential reign of terror that he could have if he uses this to springboard onto a national political scene. That's not beyond the realm of possibility, and he is no less extreme than the former president. So if you're from Florida, register to vote and vote. If you are not from Florida and you have any spare money that you want to donate to either Val Dennings or Charlie Crist, our governor candidate on the Democratic side, he's a stand-up dude. I am happy to vote for him if he was against a lesser candidate than, less evil candidate than DeSantis. I'd still probably vote for Charlie Crist. But, donate if you can, spread awareness if you can, take the time to do something if you can do something, because it is so potentially consequential what happens in this election. Well, that's all I wanted to lecture at you about today. I think that's probably plenty enough. Thank you so much for your time, my nieces and nephews and nibblings out there. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you later.